Welcome to the Slow Reckoning podcast, where we talk about the gap between what we know and how we live. I'm your host, Amarinder Sidhu. My guest today is Nina Bandelj, Chancellor's professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of California, Irvine, which also happens to be my alma mater. The topic of our discussion is Nina's new book, Overinvested: The Emotional Economy of Modern Parenting, which came out earlier this year. As a parent, the book really resonated with me. It's a fascinating examination of parenting, the exhausting labor it demands, and the emotional burden we carry raising kids in today's world. During the conversation, we dig into how parenting has become an emotional economy, how economics and parental love have quietly merged in the modern household, and what that means for parents, kids, and society at large. Please enjoy my conversation with Nina Bandelj. So, Nina, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me. I look forward to talking to you today.
So, wanted to ask you, how's it like being at the UCI campus these days? As you know, that's my alma mater, and I attended it from 2006 to 2008. How do you find that campus these days?
I love that we have this connection, Amarinder. I would like to share that, in fact, when you emailed me with this invitation, I was in Mirage School of Management, where you got your MBA several years back, but I arrived even earlier. So I've been at UCI for 23 years, believe it or not, in the sociology department, not the business school. But that day I was talking about my book and talking to my colleagues there, with whom I have a lot in common. We're all interested in economy, organizations. So it was just a few hundred feet away from my own office. Over the years, I would say some things have changed and a lot of things have stayed the same. As a sociologist, I observe the social context. And I think the social context has changed somewhat, especially for the higher education. Still come across lots of great students and lots of great colleagues. And I think that's what makes a place one that I continue to enjoy and consider an academic family.
Very cool. I've been meaning to ask you ever since we booked this conversation. I have a layman's understanding of sociology as a scientific study of human society, social relationships, and institutions. I wanted to ask a practitioner, how would you explain sociology to someone like me or rest of the audience who's not from the field?
It's a great question because I think a lot of people intuitively think they know what sociology is, and then they ask, why do you need to study this? It just
Exactly.
seems it's about people and what we do, and we all know sociology. So I like the fact that you pointed out that it is a systematic scientific study of human behavior, not so much what happens inside one's person, as psychologists would be interested in, or even neuroscientists, but in our interactions with each other. And that happens at a level of, two people, the two of us talking, and one could observe, our nonverbal communication, how much we pause. So some sociologists do things at a very, very micro level, do things like breaching experiments. When you break social norms, you go into an elevator and you may stand in a different direction to expose how much what we do as people is really taken for granted. And so I think that's one of the beauties, but also tricks in some ways of sociology, is that we try to explain systematically often what people take for granted, believe things are just the way they are, but then we understand them as sociologists in a social context and often point out how they change across time and space, how not only the interaction between two people, but in small groups, and then even in society. So I started with something very micro, a conversation we might have, which could be a site of investigation for sociologists. But a lot of my colleagues also study big data sets and how societies change over time, or compare societies and their level of development or welfare. And so we also have that huge scope that is of interest to me. I've tried to dabble a little bit at the more interactional level, but also at the broader societal transformational level.
Yeah, and I can imagine, like you pointed out, the difference between a psychologist and a sociologist, but so much of these things are intertwined. And I imagine you start studying one topic and then you get into another. Now, I also understand that you are an economic sociologist. How's that different from just general sociology?
Happy absolutely to say more about that, because that is an area of sociology that I've been working in for several decades now. And it's close to what economists do, in particular, in how we want to understand economic processes, but how social forces influence those. So I say I study money, I love money as an object of inquiry, not necessarily for the other obvious reasons, but I hope
Yeah.
listeners' attention has peaked. There's social meaning to money, however. There's how our values influence what we do with it, our emotions, and relationships that we have with people. So that is more at the micro level of economic sociology. Relational work is something we say we try to understand when we think about what sort of relationships matter for different kinds of monetary transfers.
Mhm.
So, you did not send me a bribe to be on this podcast because this would not be appropriate. And you're not even paying me because we're doing this and enjoying the conversation. And it would feel a little awkward if I received compensation. But
That's
obviously,
right.
at our workplaces, this is a natural way of expressing this relationship. So, a lot of things are intriguing when some of these norms break. And, what do we do if our friend comes to tutor our child? Do we pay them? Do we give them a gift? So it's at this more interactional level that we try to understand money, but also how it changes over time, and the inequalities that different processes related to money and economy produce. So I would say that an economic sociologist takes economy and production and investment and consumption and exchange as an object of inquiry, but really tries to situate it into the social context and how institutions, how cultural understandings, and how distributions of power matter in these processes.
I read in one of your interviews related to the book that, um, related to the point you made earlier, that you like to follow the money. And did that have some role to play in how you stumbled upon this topic of parenting as one area of sociology? Talk to us a little bit about how your interests sort of aligned with this area that eventually became your book, and then where in that process specifically there was a trigger where you thought like, oh, there's a book there. How did that all come about?
Okay, I'm glad we have a little bit of time because it was a long time ago. This project was, well, may I use a pun, slow reckoning, right?
Yeah,
It
yeah.
was long in the making.
As I get older, I think I realize that everything that you find um, kind of insightful or life changing as an idea, that forms inside you slowly over time, and hence the name of the blog. Thank you for mentioning that.
I agree. I don't think I could have finished earlier. And I have to say, I am, of course, in a particular position as a professor at the university with the privilege to take longer on this project. It wasn't my first book, which is oftentimes for book writers in sociology a key project to finish before tenure. So sort of the academic security of employment. And the fact that I could take more time, I have to acknowledge as being a privilege that we often do not have. And also, in some ways, I should say, it was over the years of the pandemic,
Mhm.
and that was unprecedented. And I
That's right.
suppose several years just flew by and added to this project. But to begin, I guess, in how this book baby was conceived, if I may use a connection to the topic of parenting very literally, I did follow money. So before you ask me questions related to economic sociology, and nowhere in there, I guess I gave a hint that I know much about family sociology or children.
Mhm.
And that's true. I studied foreign direct investment. I studied money interactions between different groups and did some experiments related to that too, in addition to big data set analyses on household data. And in those data, I saw how much money parents were devoting to their children. So the following of the money was really to respond to where I thought there was a lot of action,
Yeah.
surprisingly to me, because it wasn't just money spent in expenditures, but also debt.
Yes.
So if I may reveal that I did not grow up in the United States, and I grew up in a context where at that time, taking on debt was not something people were very keen on doing. It felt like, kind of the last resort. So it's about the money for children, but also this notion, very simply for somebody who observes these things from some sort of a distance, to ask, why would one need to go into debt to raise
Yes.
children? So it was these things that were going through my mind when I began looking into data, mostly quantitative data, trends over time. And then I realized that, well, very practically, as a professor, to support my graduate students working with me and helping me with this project, I would need funds. And at that point, a National Science Foundation had open calls for sociology projects. I mention this because these days things are changing very much. And I am very well aware that without a grant from the National Science Foundation, in some way, without kind of the understanding of this country, that research and creative effort that might help us understand processes in society, not only, natural experiments, but also how societies change, what very concretely parents do with children as it relates to money and debt, might be a good subject of inquiry. So I applied for a grant, and I guess I could say there are different paths: no grant, no big project, no
Hmm.
book at the very end, because the grant also allowed us to talk to parents, meaning
Yeah.
that I thought, okay, if this is a bigger project worthy of investment from the National Science Foundation, then we would complement these trends of broad scale analyses of financial data of households and families since the 1990s to the present, with talking to parents and trying to understand how they think of parenting, how they think of what they do with money for children. And so included, in the end, it ended up being 120 people across different backgrounds. And indeed, I needed a full research team of my graduate students to
Yeah.
support that
But I
inquiry.
think overall, those conversations make the book what it is. I feel like in a lot of books which talk about these societal trends, there's a lot of data, and sometimes it becomes too wonky and it's hard to follow how that relates to my life. But I think those live conversations where you talk to parents and you try to correlate what you see in the data with what is happening in their lives, I think that's what makes this book unique, because I feel like a lot of those conversations resonated with me as I was reading that. So in regards to the conversation of the book, I wanted to start with this quote, which kind of hits you right at the beginning of the book. So I'll just read it for everyone who's listening, and for you as well, just to refresh your memory. Um, so start of quote: "It's the cute kiddo sitting in a high chair at the head of the dinner table for whose childcare parents must set aside thousands of dollars. It's the school-age children who are the bosses dictating the family schedule, with parents bending, twisting, and reorganizing their lives to shuttle them to soccer, dance, scouts, violin, piano, chess, coding, swim practice, taekwondo, ice hockey, little league, kumon, Russian school of math, figure skating, fencing, horseback riding, you name it. It's for the kids' college that we may need to take out a second mortgage because, after all, a good parent needs to do everything to help their children realize their potential, whether they can afford it or not. There is no doubt that parenting today is a highly emotionally and financially taxing enterprise that, together with the industries and policies that scaffold it, makes up what I call the emotional economy of parenting. Now, this resonated a lot because my kids are 13 and 9 now. And I do remember not too long ago, they were sitting at a high chair. We didn't have that big a dinner table or lunch table. It was like a small table, but they used to sit in that high chair. We are in that middle phase now where my wife and I, we juggle our schedules to drop at all these classes and things like that. It does get taxing, dare I say, annoying at times because, you have to pull out from other things that you would like to do. And then, yes, we do worry about how to make sure we have enough for the kids' college. But you call all of this as like this phenomena, which is emotional economy. And I know you have a whole framework around it. So that's what I wanted to start with. What do you mean by emotional economy of parenting?
You picked a quote that tells us a lot about the activities and about money that is spent and devoted to those. And we talked mostly about these economic and practical aspects. But I think what is important to realize, and after talking to parents in interviews, and that was not just data, those are real life stories. So thank you for sharing, Amarinder, that it also resonated with you as a parent. There was so much love and devotion that undergirded these activities. And yes, sometimes annoying, but even that, annoyance is an emotional response to everything that we're doing in some ways. So I think while as an economic sociologist, it seems obvious I follow money and activities and maybe even time and measured effort. What pulls it all together and why I think it's really hard for parents to change these practices is because we have begun to understand them as good parent, as part of what a loving parent does. And so it's emotions that influence these processes, but these economic realities also influence our emotions, our sense of self, really emotional lived experience of parenthood. And I think that was an important part of the book through the discovery process to realize that while I wanted to say something about activities for children, the emotional economy highlighted also this emotional experience, parents living this reality.
Yeah, I mean, as parents, you would, or at least I would think, what else would you do if not doing this, right? But I think what you're trying to highlight in the book is that there are forces at play which has made the environment or the conditions or the milieu in which we do our parenting. First of all, the parenting, the frame, the term itself, I'm thinking of it as something that is a job for us to do. Like it's all kind of connected. And you point out two different broad things here, which kind of has filtered into the practice of parenting. One of it is economization of life. Another one is emotionalization of life. I'd like to talk about these a little bit, one by one, unpack them, and then kind of bring it to a conclusion, like how this filters into parenting. So from your research, from your conversations, how do we perceive this impact of economization of life and emotionalization of life within parenting itself? What do we see? What do we do that is an indicative of these two things that have happened? And you went back to historically to 1940s and 50s, detailing some of these changes.
Yes, these are big words, tongue twisters.
Yeah.
And so emotional economy in some ways is a shorthand because it combines processes of economization, and that is a sense of how much the economic style of reasoning, that is our understanding of thinking in investment return terms, in cost benefit analysis, that seems really natural, but has not been necessarily so dominant in how we approach things within the household. And in addition to that, at the broader structural level, economization is to capture that we live in a financialized society. That is, that finance activities related to money are have exploded over the past decades, so that it's not only that we put aside savings, let's say, for children, but that the industry around us has made a multitude of financial instruments available for us to do this. So it's both kind of the normative approach to thinking about family life, and that is that it's become in some ways work, investment, that we hustle at it, that we need to be productive, that then we also suffer burnout. All of these words, I think, that I listed are very much words we would use when we describe economic processes in the marketplace. And so I traced how these tendencies have entered into the family life. And I think it's a new dimension of that. Obviously, there's always has been an economic dimension to family. Let's not, forget that there's a lot of economic activity that goes into in the home. And even, decades ago, a century ago, children had a very explicit economic role for a family. They would contribute to economic welfare. They would work on the family farm, let's say, or do more household chore work than kids do these days. And they would also, in fact, work in factories in the 19th to transition to 20th century, after which we banned child labor and sent kids to school. So the economic dimension has always been present. I want to note that, but the particular expression of it today is different. In particular, how I think parents conceive of their role, and to call it a job. So, that's kind of, to me, a quintessential example of economization, when we don't even blink to say, oh, parenting is a job. It's the hardest job, but the most rewarding one. And maybe this is a phrase to signal that there's also the other side of the economization processes, and those are the emotional ones, right? We call it a job, but we are willing to do this. We would sacrifice a lot to do it, and it doesn't feel like we can do otherwise because we do it with this devotion. It's in some ways the most sacred work that parents say is oftentimes their purpose in life. And so I think we believe these are natural expressions of parenting today, but I try to put them in a historical context. And the emotional components also have their history, as I write in the book.
Yes, one of the things that I wanted to kind of drill deeper into it is this phenomena of looking at children as human capital.
Yeah.
Right. So our job as a parent is to make sure that they're well trained, they have the right skills, they are ready to participate in the world of labor, or they get trained and become productive citizens. And this idea is not very old at all, right? And that's what you mentioned growing up in Slovenia before we started this podcast, and I grew up in India, and my father was the first one who actually went to college, and everybody else worked in the fields. And he often tells me now that at that time, his education was really like bonus. He's going to college, it's understood, but he was expected to come and help out in whatever else was going on. And I think the thing you point out um, very well in the book is that that's something that has perhaps changed in a couple of generations. Maybe it happened a little bit later in India. In US, it happened sooner because that's what the book focuses on in a large part. And nobody wants to go back to the exploitative child labor, but now we think of kids, their sole purpose is to just study and focus on their education and focus on their school, to the extent that we as parents even hesitate sometimes to assign them chores within the household. And simple tasks like emptying the dishwasher, or like I've been training my son to take out the trash every Sunday. These are small tasks. In no way they um, interfere with their studies, but you found in your interviews that parents actually uh, suggest or think that they don't assign these kind of things to kids anymore because they want them to focus on school.
Yes. So the whole discussion before on economization did not even mind, that is, bring up a central economic concept that this book revolves around and how it applies to family. And that is, as you said, how the way we think about children has changed. And children are not just young human beings, but they are human capital. And that is a collection of skills and talents and abilities that are mostly cultivated through schooling and various forms of education. And so I think it's important to note that, even in the 60s, early 70s, the use of the notion of human capital wasn't as widespread as it is today. So when I say, children are human capital, there's no hesitation with that. Most people actually very much support that it's a positive thing to discuss. But I think we need to be aware of how concepts are not just innocent. And so that when we think of children as human capital, then therefore we think of what parents do as this capitalization project. And that's why you have to be productive and you have to hustle. And it's on parents to ensure that little children are going to be productive participants in the labor market. That's the theory, right? To take micro economics into the home and make an argument about how what families do may impact economic growth in the aggregate. But it's not about, conducive work conditions at a workplace. It's about what parents may start to do or are requested to think about or sort of pushed to embrace as early as in utero.
Yeah.
It's like one has to worry. There was these ideas of playing Mozart or, really taking care of health and all sorts of restrictions or not, that will be good for the child. And not only just as child as a little human being, but their
or mothers
development.
or mothers to eat certain type of foods that'll aid in brain development or things like
Exactly.
that.
Yes. And so I think that's, now we think about it, okay, but it links back to how it starts really early. And then, I have data in the book that shows how, for instance, full-time participation in preschool. So to have 3 to 5 year olds who, I don't know from your experience, but my son certainly could not sit still for a long time, are full-time in preschool.
Yes.
Mostly, right? From about 20% in the 1970s to more than 2/3 of children ages 3 to 5 go full time to
Yeah,
preschool.
and I found that fact startling because when we were making our decisions to send our kids to preschool, it was almost as if we are not sending them to preschool, are we missing out on something? And are we not doing our job as parents? And back then we used to live in Massachusetts and there was competition to get into the one that was considered the best preschool. And it was a little bit of less of a problem for my daughter because they gave preference to the siblings of the kids who were already there. The other piece around that, which was very surprising, because I would have imagined before reading your book that all this was because, more of the mothers have to go into work now. But what you found out was that there is no correlation between kids going into early childhood education and mothers being at work. Like this is a secular trend happening for all the other reasons that we talked about.
Yeah. No, it's true. I actually show this in a graph because the first impulse might be, and I love readers to be anticipating and sort of critically reading. So when you present a fact that there has been such a tremendous change in kids' participation full time, one thinks, well, parents need to work. Mothers are working. So this might be childcare, right? That's why they have to spend so many hours. And that's not exactly the case, because over this time period, women's participation in the labor force has not at all changed as drastically as full-time participation in pre-primary education, as data calls it. But I think what's important is that we worry about this so much. As you mentioned, I had a colleague say, oh, I don't know, this is going to be a little exposing, but as soon as the stick turns blue, meaning you found out you're pregnant, you have to put your name somewhere because these are scarce places. And it's not only taking care of children, but, we even call it early childhood education centers these days.
Yes.
It's preschool. Even the name for this signals something more than daycare or childcare.
Yeah,
So I
I've
point that
noticed that
out.
transition. You hardly see a board which says preschool anymore. Almost all of them say early childhood education. Or
Yeah.
another word I see, and I'm sure you've encountered that too, enrichment.
Yeah.
This term. And I remember when my kids were in preschool, there was a preschool that ended at 2:30 or 3. Then there was this another kind of extended daycare that ran from 3:30 to 5 or something like that, and that was called enrichment class.
Yeah.
And back then we didn't have any choice but to leave our kids there. But very often when I used to pick them up, I used to wonder like what kind of enrichment is going on, because you see the kids, they were all exhausted and tired and they just want to go home. And but that's how it was presented to the parents. And
Yeah.
I'm not casting myself out of that system. I think we were trying to do the best as we can, just as every other parent was.
Yeah. No, I think that notion of, you have to say it's not just for kids to rest after a busy day and have some unstructured playtime. I don't think that marketing would sell very well, or that maybe, unfortunately, it's acceptable these days. And I think this is how we signal how our understanding of what we need to do with children has changed through simple things like that, right? To call it enrichment, to have it structured. And if it's not just in that one center, then a parent needs to take children somewhere. I remember I wasn't quite as intentional, or perhaps we were traveling and then, kids get priority and our child was not there when the spot opened up, which is so stressful, by the way. And so we did not, after kindergarten, have any activities or childcare that was guaranteed. And we found a place close by, filling those hours before 5 p.m. And possibly as a professor, I felt like, okay, I'll have to adjust my work and leave early because of all these activities. And I think we need to recognize that, right? How much of an adjustment it is for parents' careers sometimes
Yep.
to do all of that work in the
Yeah,
home.
and I think it's important to recognize that all of these are not just secular market trends. It's a symptom of that financialization that you mentioned earlier. And that point resonated with me a lot more than a few other things, because I recently read a book on neoliberalism, which was from a UK author, George Monbiot. I don't know if you've heard of him. And he talks about this ideology, economic ideology about capitalism, which is neoliberalism, that you talk about in the book in the context of US, but I think it's kind of spreading everywhere in the world, where you want to have as much as possible market forces in every aspect of public services, right? And you mentioned an example where you couldn't find anything for your kids in the school, and then you had to rely on whatever else was available. And increasingly, it's private options which are available for these type of things rather than public options. 2008 market crisis in mortgage industry happened because of this thinking, and now it's the same thinking propagating into the services that are available to parents as well, where more and more the options that are available are privatized, not public, right?
Absolutely. I have a chapter in the book called The Parenting Business, and I think it's really important. I'm glad you raised this point, um, to understand these market forces and sort of the growth in offering all of these activities through markets, not public goods. And so even education, right, is we talk about this a lot as professors, to what extent even at the state university, funding for education that comes from the state has really shrunk. And so the marketization of the university, but then, of course, the provision of all sorts of shadow education activities. The tutoring markets are, exploding. It's billions of dollars, and it's a global market. The youth sports industry complex, I have to tell you, I was giving a presentation, so I looked up some of the data that, in the book may even be outdated already.
I know.
I think I have a figure of 20 billion in around 2019 for the youth sports industry. And in April of this year, I came across an article that named a 40, so twice as much in 6 years, billion industry, and how private equity is interested in entering these markets, which, to an economic sociologist signals very much how there's a smell of profits to be made.
Yeah.
And I think I don't talk about private equity in the youth sports, but I think I mention it at least in a footnote for the childcare business. So I think we do have this growing and demanding infrastructure that capitalizes on these norms that I write about in the book of invested parenting. But I think these are very much processes that are encroached in the structure of privatization, of marketization, of financialization, more broadly, neoliberalism.
Yeah, you mentioned private equity, and that rang a bell. I was listening to a podcast recently about small businesses and acquiring small businesses. We often refer to private equity as the Blackstones of the world and all these large private equity companies who do leverage buyouts. But then there is this push to acquire small businesses as well, and private equity is getting into that. And on that podcast, they mentioned that the hottest growing areas in small businesses, youth enrichment. And a big part of that is sports, which you refer to as parenting industrial complex. And I think, and a lot of it is not that good quality, but just again, as I referred to earlier, it's a collective action problem. You see everybody else doing it, and then you start wondering whether I'm missing out on something for my kids by not sending them to RSM or Art of Problem Solving or, all these little leagues or more of these leagues, which are more and more private right now. So I think that is certainly happening, and I've seen that happening live, and I've read about it as well. And you described very eloquently and with a lot of data on how that has spread into parenting. Now, let's talk about the other side, the decision-making of parents who are dealing with all of this. And a lot of emotions at play over there instead of just looking at the data, as you often talk about in the book. And I think part of it is, you mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, it is our desire to be a good parent. Like, we're not intentionally making those choices. We just want to be able to do as good as possible. What did you discover in your conversation with parents or research for this book around that part? And that's I think the emotional part of the emotional economy comes from that part, right?
Yeah. So I do want to start with a little bit of sociology here, related to these extracurricular activities. So in 2003, a big book came out by a sociologist who was also president of the American Sociological Association, sort of the biggest national organization, a very prominent person, Annette Lareau, who just recently retired from the University of Pennsylvania, who looked at parenting, and in particular how different class backgrounds of parents matter in what they do with their children. And so that this extracurricular activity involvement, she found, was very much a feature of upper middle class parents who had a particular understanding of what they need to do with their children to pass on, in some ways, their privilege, their advantage, something that sociologists call cultural capital. How do
Hmm.
you know how to behave in institutions? Something quite intangible that's really hard to learn. So it comes from generations of advantage, and it continues in that way. She calls this process concerted cultivation. So it's a parenting style that is so intentional and has a lot of extracurricular activities. So the research for this book was in the 1990s. So, decades have passed.
Yeah.
So I start with this to say that this is no longer just what the select, more well-to-do families do. Putting kids into extracurricular activities and scheduling their time is now a widespread understanding of what we need to do as parents. So we saw that parents across socioeconomic backgrounds, different racial backgrounds, people who are first generation immigrant parents and others, everyone has embraced this idea because it's become a norm of parenting.
Hmm.
Now, to what extent one has resources to participate in this top end, industrial complex where you have to buy videotaping services for your kid because you can't just take a picture of them because it's all part of the package that this private club, soccer club is selling to you. And you need to sign a waiver that you won't be doing your own pictures. I mean, it's kind of a little ridiculous. I think Senator Chris Murphy had an article in The Atlantic about his son's hockey league that functions at this level and really linked it, right, to kind of this privatization, marketization of even things like enjoying your kids' activities and,
Yeah.
being proud. So basically, the activities themselves are part of what we all do, and the industry supports this. But the way I think in the media hear the portrayal of these activities often is that they are to set up our kids to go to college. So I wanted to mention that when we did talk to a broad array of families, so not only the most privileged ones, or not only the ones who really, and I'm sure there are families like that, very intentionally pick activities since, the first grade or even earlier that the kid can put on their resume. Also, as a side note, because a whole industry of college counselors would tell you need to do this, right? Not just because somehow you believe this is the way to proceed, but when we talk to a broader range, and these were parents that had at least one child, that's how we picked it following this big study by Annette Lareau. Because I was
Hmm.
really interested to what extent class matters, and it's important to, build scholarship on the shoulders of giants. So it particularly looked into this idea of extracurriculars and who does it. And it was widespread, but also the top things parents told us why they do this were related to building a kid's character, right? Supporting their personal growth, having them be physically active because they didn't feel like kids were running around or doing things, just outside on the street. That's true, right? Our physical environment is quite limiting in those respects. And also building social skills, building relationships. So in some ways, kind of a far cry from this resume building
Yes.
cultivation, if you'd like. But notably, these were middle school children. And I think a lot of it is that it's like, well, what does a parent do? Everyone else is doing these activities. But not all everyone has this notion of where this will lead and a strategic investment building sense. It's more what we see we should do as good parents. So I think this links to a study that I mentioned in the book, but didn't do myself, where there was an anecdote about what a parent does with a child presented to um, respondents, again, across different class and fathers and mothers alike, and with the child being a daughter or a son. So all sorts of variations and different configurations. But generally, what parents believed was excellent parenting across the board was when they read a scenario where a parent did not leave a child to just do things on their own or be bored a little bit, but they had to either schedule their time or be very attentive themselves. Like, be teachers of our own children in any sort of interaction, drawing something and what is the color and what shapes is this, quickly some little lesson right there. And I think that's also part of this human capitalization. Parents don't say human capital. They don't even say investment more broadly, but they have this notion that what they do with children is very educational, and that's what matters.
Yeah, I think one thing I want to note around self-play or unsupervised play, as it's often referred to, there are no avenues for kids to do that anymore. I remember growing up, I mostly played in the streets. There was no supervisor ever, and sometimes you would even get beaten, and you would get crying home, and your mom would say, "Yeah, just do something different next
Deal
time.
with
Don't
it.
deal with it." But now I feel, especially, I mean, I've seen with my son as he's gotten into middle school, kids have stopped showing up in parks or these public places to play, and then as a parent, you wonder, you know, what are they supposed to do? And you try to find things for them to do. And I feel like sometimes it's this catch 22, like as I mentioned
Yeah.
earlier. Maybe I should put them into some activity too, so that they're making use of their time more. But I think that's like the collective action problem, I would
Yeah.
assume. But it's kind of hard as a parent sometimes.
Yeah, first of all, just this whole idea of a play date. So even if it's less structured, not into an activity, the two parents coordinate, right? Because you can't just have a child wander around and pick up something and there will be other kids. Often they're not other kids.
Yeah.
It's also this sense that, is it really safe? I had my son bike
Yeah.
around the neighborhood, and it absolutely a great neighborhood. And we intentionally try to give more opportunity for independence. But would receive a message from a colleague said, "Oh, we saw your son. Do you want us to keep an eye on him?" And I think, partly I wanted to be very grateful that we have such a great community, but at the same time, for him to not be supervised by somebody, by
Yeah.
an adult, was the experience that we try to offer. And it's really very, very hard. I have actually heard recently, it gives me a little bit of hope, of having parents get together and say, okay, this is not just a play date between two children, but we have organized some space where several kids come together and parents take turns a little bit. And it's, not so special, but kind of on a rotating schedule, that we have a group, right? A group, like a little pod that
Yeah.
parents would have, let's say, during the pandemic. So some of it, those are possibly the positive effects of how we need to quickly reorganize many of these educational activities when it wasn't possible to rely on schools and take kids outside.
Yeah, I think you mentioned middle class and upper middle class, where some of these things you've noticed. And I know the book focuses primarily on US, but when I look across the Indian society, where I grew up, and I would call it middle class, low middle class, and the same trends I see over there too. I don't see kids playing in the streets. I don't see unsupervised play as it used to be. And the thing about safety, that concern is over there too, where people feel it's not safe to leave the kids alone. I feel like it's kind of the same thing that is propagating everywhere. Um, so I wanted to talk about this one other thing, which is viewing children as investment projects, right? Which is kind of, I would see like the sum total of this emotional economy that we feel like we are investing time, money, and, our
Emotions.
and emotions into them. And I think you asked parents about what is your expectation, and you got like a wide variety of answers. I have my answer, but I don't know anymore based upon what I read. So I was curious, what was your discovery in that regard?
Yes. So let's just put it to a listener right now. If you are a parent and a researcher comes and you have a conversation about all these things you do for your children, and the interviewer asks, so you do a lot for your children. What do you expect your children to do for you? What would you answer? And the most common answer was nothing. Not that they didn't say anything, but they literally said that they don't expect much from their children and that it's not something they should expect. It's not like they would say previous generations where it felt like, parents raise children, so the children take care of parents in old age. There was a parent who joked, who said, oh, with my wife, we sometimes say that, of course, there will be here to take care of us. But then he says, oh, but it's always tongue in cheek. That's
Yeah.
not really our expectation. Then we probed, right? Because sometimes people say, and it's important to acknowledge that what folks say reflects social norms. And so this whole norm of the kind of devoted, selfless parenting came across very well. But, if you ask a second question or a third question, but those questions did not lead us to something, very concrete in terms of paying parents or helping them out in old age as an expectation. It was paying them back, I should say, right? With all this investment that goes into, maybe there's some sort of a return. Parents talked about, if anything, they would like to have a good relationship with their children. And they didn't take that for granted, that children would even want to necessarily have them around. They said, if children would want to, I would love that. There's a few who would say, and I know parenting is really hard, so if they have their own children, we would like to help out. So
Yes.
this continued devotion and sort of focus on the child came across. But the whole idea of a good relationship, a loving relationship, is also linked to something we haven't quite yet talked about so much, but you set up as my main theoretical infrastructure for this book. It's about economization together with emotionalization of life.
Right.
So I think the emphasis on kids having a relationship with their parents and how much this is important is one thing that I think is qualitatively different across generations. There is data by the Pew Research Center that asks parents, how are you parenting compared to how you were parented? So,
Yes.
what did your parents do? What are you doing? So, this is sort of the closest we can get because I couldn't travel back in time and ask your or my parents to tell me their stories at that point. But from parents, when they were comparing, they did not say their parenting is different because they discipline their children differently. They didn't really say that it was different because the values have changed so starkly. They, something is important to them, but wasn't so much to their parents. Nor they would kind of religion, let's say, right? It was more at one point or another. None of these things came across as much as having a loving relationship to your child. They thought to them, so parents today, this is a priority to the extent that it wasn't when, their parents were parenting them. Of course, one could say, who knows what parents would say? And I'm pretty sure they would say they love their children. But the preoccupation that, in a sense, you need to be there all the time emotionally available, that cultivating this relationship and securing emotional well being of your child is so front and center, I think is related to how our society has changed in this emotionalization aspect. And what I mean by that is that increasingly we think of emotions, not necessarily analytical thinking, as the way we think of ourselves, we think of others, in some ways, a compass in life. The way we pick our political candidates, the way we respond to a debate with an emoji, because we
Yes.
usually respond on social media. And so I think these are small examples of how emotions have become central because we have also had a scaffolding of those processes. We call it a growth of a therapeutic culture. That
Yes.
is lots of services that support not only therapy in a kind of mental health sense, but different kinds of activities, even within a workplace, that talk about engagement and coaching of employees to have emotional intelligence. Maybe even mindfulness is something that we've seen embraced at a workplace. And then, of course, in the home for parents, it is everywhere in how they receive advice from books, which I analyzed. So I analyzed about, more than 100 books since kind of the early 1900s, where, by the
That's
way,
amazing. By the way, I read about that in the book. That's amazing. Like being able to read 100 books. I'm sure that would have
well,
taken a long time, but I'm sure
content
you noticed certain
analysis,
patterns as well when you were reading
yeah,
them.
just to be sure, not word by word, but what are the main themes, how the book is described, what is the title, who wrote it. And you could see how this has shifted. By the way, in the 1920s, hugging your children was not considered the best thing to do. You would spoil them, right?
Yeah.
It's like you have to discipline them in a different way. And of course, attachment and this loving connection and preoccupation with their emotional well being there for children, and also to think about their happiness as a goal, right? Such an explicit goal that we're here to basically secure their happiness. Those, I think, have changed over time and become much more pronounced because of this emotional orientation that we have in life. So, to go back as to why parents answered nothing, it was because this is what a good parent does. They do it out of love.
Yep.
And to say, if anything, a loving relationship, it also reflects the fact that this is how we think of the role of parents today. Parents go to such great sacrifices, both financially, but also emotionally. And that's why I think it's hard. It's hard because we often feel guilty that we don't do things. Or other parents, we have this term, parent shame. How did it even come to be? The fact
Yeah.
that others view us as not doing enough. And that's something that keeps going in our minds. So I think that, of course, a device seeking culture is more broad. But for parents today, I analyze books, and thank you for your compliment, Amarinder, but I didn't even get to social media. So
Yes.
obviously, anytime you pick up your phone these days, you, even if not reading it, it's in the back of your mind what potentially you should or should not be doing. It's so hard to take a step back. The disciplining of the parent self, to use a little bit of sociological jargon, is happening constantly.
Yeah, I think in maybe like even 2 decades ago, if you would go to internet to look up some information, you'll find research papers or articles or maybe even recommendations for books. But these days, you find links to reels and TikToks, and these are mostly people who are influencers, and they are just saying things or recommending things or suggesting things from their personal experience, and they're not necessarily embedded in research. But then again, if you see that everywhere, that kind of becomes this collective thing again, where you start feeling that you're missing out on. But do you think this whole thing about emotions getting center stage um, is an outcome of this broader trend going back to 50s and 60s, just mental health becoming important. How do we feel? What our emotions are in a particular state? Like this therapy culture that has grown in general, in that sort of has made it into uh, parenting. Do you think that,
Mhm.
do you find that link?
Yes, I think I want to be clear that in my argument, these changes related to emotionalization of life are not necessarily a response to the economic processes. A lot of folks would say that because inequality has increased, then we need to do more investment in our children. But I would like to, based on this, quite systematic research, point out that the therapeutic culture and sort of the emphasis on the emotional aspect of life, not only by offering all sorts of services, but also studying emotions as an object of inquiry. We call it an turn to affect in social sciences and humanities. There's more and more attention to this. You have different, maybe art performances that are
Hmm.
very explicit about it. So, in various aspects of life through science and obviously consumption, Oprah Winfrey comes to mind, right? In
Yeah.
1986, she had her first show. It was right there. And then it was Dr. Phil, who was explicitly a show about you come with your problems and everyone is listening in. And mind you, during that time in the 1990s, a big, I love the show, so I'll mention it. The Sopranos, on the mafia boss, Tony Soprano,
Hmm.
seeks counsel from a therapist, right? So it legitimized the fact that even a mafia boss, even somebody who is, supposedly immune to the broader culture or could do things on his own, um, needs a therapist. And I think, to move to today, I don't know to what extent listeners follow and what are their favorite shows, but one popular one is Drinking, and it
Hmm.
is about therapists, where it is Harrison Ford, who is one of the therapists. So one could say Indiana Jones is provides therapeutic advice these days. So I just mentioned some of these things from popular culture to signal that these are very powerful and autonomous in some ways processes
Yeah.
that don't just reflect, neoliberalism, but have this um, dimension to our life that fits really well with economization because both of them are very
Yeah.
self-oriented.
Yeah.
So when we say human capitalization, and I think I mentioned this example, it's about an individual having to be productive, not the conditions of work having to be better, but it's an individual that invests in oneself and parents that invest into their kids for them to, you know, contribute to economic growth. Similarly, the therapeutic culture is about me. It's about my problems, surely also the children's, but it is still a very much a private affair. And so I say that while we think sometimes that economy and emotions are kind of on two sides of the river and they have little in common, they in fact marry each other quite well in this emotional economy of parenting.
Yeah. I think the supply of services they exploit that emotional element in terms of selling us those services. And I feel like that piece you mentioned about individualized or privatized parenting, that's also like the way, I remember George Monbiot's book about neoliberalism, where they talk about that the central feature of a neoliberal economy is competition and getting ahead in market and everything around buying and selling. To bring us around to like what is the impact of these two broad trends on parents and parenting in general. One is obvious, right, which we all feel as parents, which is being exhausted, being tired and being frazzled all the time. But you describe in the book that the effect is a little bit broader as well, right? Like this whole focus on me and my child and they getting ahead um, produces adverse outcomes for all of us. And talk to us a little bit about that. That's something I had a brief notion of it, but while reading the book, I was like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Thank you. And I'm especially grateful you say so because this is the sociological lesson of the book. Um, I did not intend to know what I would find at the end of the day. It seemed debt was growing, but sometimes debt is good. But when you see that it's mostly debt for lower and lower middle class folks, that debt can put a lot of burden. And so it's not just good debt, sort of to create more wealth. Or when you see burnt out parents, you can say, oh, parents just want to sacrifice everything. Who cares if the children are going to be better off? Maybe that's all we need to do. But then research is showing that children are not necessarily better off with this over-involved, very managed kind of childhood that they're experiencing. But in addition to burnt out parents, children sometimes struggling, there's also broader consequences for society. So when you have so much of parenting around money, clearly there are families who can do this more or can even benefit from, tax advantaged savings accounts for college, the 529s that I write about in the book. Or they, of course, can take some loans and can have the money exposable elsewhere or put aside assets for children so that it creates intergenerational wealth.
Even take on
Those,
mortgages, which are big and
right.
huge, which puts them into better public schools, for example. Like
Ab-
that's part of it.
yes, yes, for sure. So, but this is the way that money filters into growing difference. And I think when we don't consider school public investment, because even in public schools, oftentimes we see such huge differences in resources. And you have well-to-do parents who can contribute through fundraising and all sorts of things. So that certainly there's, one public school is not the same as
Same
another
as the
public
other.
school, even though they're called public. Um, then we see how difference across families can grow through this mechanism of parenting. I will come back to this idea of, parenting could be a way to pass on advantage uh, through concerted cultivation, that this book by Annette Lareau called Unequal Child could show. But what I think is quite tragic is that parenting today is not only about reproduction, potentially, of inequality. It is a mechanism of growing inequality. Not the only one, but quite one that we don't necessarily see so well. When we're preoccupied with our own children, it's hard to see how demands on private investment are at the expense of public investment in all children. And parents are quite silent. I thought at the end of interviews, we give them a chance to reflect. Slow reckoning, right? Sit back, and you've talked so much about what you're doing with your children. What more would you like to say? Or are there some thoughts you would like to share? I was expecting they would realize that it shouldn't just be on parents' shoulders to do all of these things.
Right.
That perhaps the sense of raising children as the new generation, members of society, needs to be shared by society. So very, very few said anything along the lines of, we would like to see more public investment. There are, however, I should note, now initiatives, especially in childcare programs, the universal childcare programs in New York with the new mayor, in New Mexico in the state, that I think I have high hopes for. I say this because with this book, I realized how relieving financial pressures is not only about money, it's also about the emotional burdens that parents feel. And so I'm hoping that through these initiatives, the new institutions, the norms can change as well. When we see children more as a, common responsibility than private property or stock of private investment.
That's right. I was listening recently to a podcast between Hassan Minhaj, and quite interestingly, he had invited the former governor, Chris Christie, on his podcast. And it was an interesting one. In one bit of the conversation, Hassan was presenting some of the Democratic planks, and how would Governor Christie would vote on it. One of them was universal childcare. And his response was interesting, flat out no. The government should not be involved in education. And I know you talk about that in the book as well. Why is there so much opposition to just political action which favors supporting parents through public resources? And we were talking about our travel before the podcast, and I was in Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and those countries do a lot, and parents get a lot of support, and they're consistently ranked as the happiest places in the world and so forth. And there are examples where we don't need to follow that example, but there's certainly, the bar is so low right now in terms of what can be done in supporting parents. Why is there still so much opposition to getting anything done legislatively?
Yeah. It's, may I say, $1 million question.
Yeah.
And a lot of books have been written about American exceptionalism in a sense of this sort of very hardcore, rugged individualism. And quite possibly that's something like public goods or social protections. Even the word social support reeks of socialism, that the country has a very fraught relationship with, meaning that consistently it's being brought up as something that the foreign other does, and America prospers in a different way. It's quite interesting that there are candidates running on a socialist platform today, and we'll see to what extent that maybe, is a shock to the system where we're really not doing well, and where parents are exhausted when it is more than a half of one's salary to pay for 2 children to put them in childcare, where, it makes such a difference if you can't afford to live in a neighborhood that has this one school, but then you have to take on a huge mortgage. That it's like the sense of competition because only certain schools at the higher education level can do something for a young person because so many struggle with college loans or unemployment, and those futures don't look promising. So sometimes, a real crisis is needed for change. I remain hopeful because I guess, to be very trite, that's the only thing we have left.
Yes.
And I do think that, what do we have to lose in terms of parents, but so much exhaustion and debt if you try to think of child rearing in a different way and reimagine this. And by the way, I think there are indications that when you just poll parents, they are supportive across the political spectrum of having more done for them in terms of both paid parental leave, where US is one of the very, very few countries that does not guarantee that at the federal level, compared to the Scandinavian countries, for instance, where those policies are much more generous, and also childcare and these unequal burdens at other levels of education. $100,000 for 1 year, a sticker price to go to college. Whew, right?
Yeah,
how far can we push that?
And that has, I think, grown from maybe like 30, 40,000 not so long ago to 100,000. It's just, frankly, it's getting to a point where it's unsustainable, even for like middle-class families, and they're feeling the pinch as well. So we talked about collective action a few times. Certainly some of the things we were talking about, policy in general, those are obvious things. But when it comes to individual action as a parent, because I certainly believe that that's the cornerstone of the larger collective action. Like when we take an individual action with collective needs in mind, that's how the change happens. So how can a parent, given the environment, given what is everything around us and what's pulling us in various different directions, how can we think about how we do our parenting differently.
Yeah. And as a sociologist, that is the toughest question because I think I've honed my skills and I have extensive expertise in analyzing this problem and say that I need to rely on others to have good ideas on how we can approach and solve this problem. But I think if I go very personal here, and in some parts of the book, you see how my own story as a mother, as a parent comes through, because that's the reality. I myself am part of this reality that I describe. And as much as I have resisted it, I know it is so very hard because I'm no exception. And I know that what feels like is very individual choices, personal feelings, are shaped by these broader social forces. So I would say this is a number one observation to take after being able to take some distance, some reflection on one's parenting practices, is to understand that we are in some ways caught in a system that is not inevitable, and that even though it seems it's so hard to step off, we should know that even research points out to the fact that any one individual parenting decision or sort of parenting style is not as consequential for how our children turn out. Our children, bottom line, will have to address their own problems and issues and go through life as young adults, and to try to prevent them from having more independent experiences or making mistakes or not spending every minute of the day in a productive educational sense is not going to engineer that happiness for them as much as we can try to imagine it. And so I think I say that if anything, my child is not an investment project. They're a budding young human being, person. And so few parents said that they think their role is to raise an independent young adult as their goal of parenting, which is very paradoxical to me. But of course, consistent with my message, that is emotions today and support right now and ensuring happiness, letting them pursue their passions. So all these emotionally oriented goals today, as opposed to thinking of how are we preparing our children to manage probably quite significant challenges in the future. And so I think to have that in mind, that not everything is so consequential, one, but secondly, to also think, what do we do? So to backtrack, one of the key lessons about this investment is that, yes, we devote money to our children in different forms. We devote emotions to our children, but we are also invested into being parents. So I wonder to what extent the activities that we sometimes do are about us more than they are for our children. So I would just ask myself often, is this truly, if I am very honest with myself, which admittedly is really hard, am I doing this for me? Or is it in the best interest of my child to become a young, independent person who is a member of society and cares about society, not only about themselves?
Yeah.
Those are my hopes.
Yeah, I think you refer to it as raising a human being rather than human capital. And I feel like that question that you just mentioned, am I doing this for me or for my child? I think that's an important one. And really, I think what you're arguing for is just taking a step back and because there is no one way of doing the best parenting or being a good parent for your own context, for your own child, for yourself as you are as a person. We all need to take a step back and think if everything that I'm doing as a parent is right for my child, and where can I step back and let them be, and where I can help them more, and so forth. It goes back to that whole concept of first of all, our responsibility is to help them being a good human being. We try to do our best with whatever we understand that means, but building that understanding and helping our kids with it, I think that is something that we can all do. So this has been an amazing conversation, Nina. Thank you for doing this. And I enjoyed it. I enjoyed reading your book. I think a lot more people need to read it, internalize it in their own ways. I know you're doing a whole bunch of conversations. I hope all of them go well and the book does well, because it really has a message that is going to help a lot of parents who are struggling with their responsibilities right now. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you, really, from the bottom of my heart. I have enjoyed it so much, and it means a lot to me that the message resonates. It is some challenging, deep thinking, but as you are trying to convey, I think, on this podcast, Amarinder, we need more of such opportunities to reflect and do some slow reckoning. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.